You are about to hear something that was never meant to leave the Nevada desert. And if this recording reaches you, then understand that the men who knew this truth before you are already dead, and that alone should tell you how dangerous knowledge can be. My name is Staff Sergeant Elias Crow, and for 6 months I guarded something buried 400 feet beneath the sand for longer than recorded human memory. They no longer call it Area 51 because that name is a mask. A distraction, a place to send curious civilians and conspiracy hunters so they never look in the right direction. The real site exists deeper and farther from the maps, and it is known only to those cleared to disappear. They call it Area 53. Before I explain what walks those tunnels at night, you need to understand how someone like me ended up there and why once you arrive you can never truly leave. They have tried to silence me in every way available to them. Threats, contracts, fear, but I am still speaking because silence would mean I guarded the darkness instead of exposing it. It began with a phone call I should never have answered, June 14, 2023. I was 3 months into a private security contract at Fort Bragg. The work was dull. Equipment inventories, gate checks, routine patrols. It paid well enough and kept me close to the only life I had known for 15 years. My discharge had been clean and honorable. 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, more combat rotations than most men survive. I was 34 years old and felt older than men twice my age. The call came at 6:30 in the morning as I finished a run around the base perimeter. Unknown number, I almost ignored it. When I answered, a clipped voice spoke my name with military precision. Staff Sergeant Crow. This is Captain Hargrove with the Department of Defense Special Operations Division. We have a contract opportunity that requires your specific skill set. Are you currently bound by any agreements that would prevent immediate reassignment? I stopped running. My breath fogged the cold morning air. Special Operations Division was not a unit I recognized, and I had worked alongside most of them during my years with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Depends on the opportunity, sir. I am contracted through September. We are aware of that. It can be terminated with cause. What we are offering is a 6-month assignment, specialized security detail, full benefits, compensation at 3 times your current rate. The work is classified at the highest level. You would undergo extensive background reinvestigation and sign documentation legally binding you to silence. 3 times my pay meant close to $20,000 a month. That kind of money never comes with simple guard duty. Where is the location? I asked. Southern Nevada, remote facility, rotational shifts, 12 hours, 4 days on, 3 days off, all lodging and meals provided. No communication with the outside during rotation. Southern Nevada meant only one thing for people with my clearance: testing ranges, black sites, installations that existed in budgets but nowhere else. I had heard whispers during my service, places that made Area 51 look like a museum tour. I asked to see the contract. A courier arrived at 2 in the afternoon with a locked briefcase and biometric tablet. I spent 4 hours reading 47 pages of the most restrictive non-disclosure agreements I had ever seen. The contract was legitimate. Department of Defense authorization codes matched my clearance. The penalties for breach included criminal prosecution, asset seizure, and decades in prison under the Espionage Act. What the contract did not include was any explanation of what I would be guarding. I signed anyway. Maybe it was the money. Maybe it was the part of me that missed the intensity, the sense that what you were doing mattered even if you could never talk about it. Looking back now, I understand they profiled me perfectly. They knew exactly who would accept and exactly why he would never walk away. Transport arrived at 6 the next morning. Black sport utility vehicle. Tinted windows, 2 silent contractors in the front. 3 hours into the Nevada desert, we passed Rachel, that cluster of trailers and alien-themed gift shops that pretend to be the edge of the unknown. Then the road disappeared, dirt became dust, dust became nothing. 3 security checkpoints, each more advanced than the last. When the facility appeared, it looked like nothing at all. Prefabricated buildings scattered across scrubland. Double-chain fence, razor wire, motion sensors, no hangars, no aircraft, nothing that would catch a satellite eye. The real installation was underground. Captain Hargrove met me inside the administration building. He was mid-40s, sun-hardened skin, eyes that never softened. He shook my hand and smiled without warmth. "Welcome to Site 17. You will complete indoctrination and medical screening today. Tomorrow, you begin rotation with Master Sergeant Pike. Any questions? What is the actual purpose of Site 17? His smile widened slightly. You will be briefed on a need-to-know basis. This facility houses assets critical to national defense. Your job is to ensure they remain secure and contained. Contained, not stored. The indoctrination lasted 6 hours. Security protocols, emergency procedures, rules of engagement. They stressed one rule repeatedly. Never enter restricted zones below level 3 without authorization. Violation meant termination and prosecution. They also warned us that certain sounds, lights, or phenomena might occur and were to be logged but never investigated. Curiosity, they said, was the fastest way to lose the contract. Medical screening followed, psychological evaluation, blood work, genetic sampling, neurological scanning. When I asked why, the technician smiled and said precautionary. That night, I met Master Sergeant Lucien Pike. Late 50s, built like a tank worn down by years of war. He had been at Site 17 for 2 years, longer than anyone else. He sat on the bunk across from mine and spoke without ceremony. 3 rules matter here. Do your shift and log what you observe. Never open a door marked red. Those locks keep things in. And if you hear screaming, you ignore it. Log it as an acoustic anomaly and move on. I stared at him, screaming. Ventilation carries sounds from deep levels, he said. Sounds human sometimes, but it is not. And if it is, then they are already dead. Get some sleep. Your shift starts at 10 tonight. The nights are longer down here. He was right. That first night we patrolled the surface perimeter. The desert was silent in a way that made every sound feel amplified. Around midnight, we returned inside for internal monitoring. The elevator descended for 90 seconds. I counted. When the doors opened, we were hundreds of feet below ground. The corridor was wide and sterile. Concrete walls, white lights every 10 feet, air recycled and metallic. Doors lined both sides. Yellow, green, and red. This is level 7. Pike whispered. We patrol to level 10. You do not open doors. You do not look inside. You do not respond to what you hear. The deeper we went, the colder it became. By level 9, I could see my breath. Then I heard it, from behind a red door, slow rhythmic breathing, too deep, too deliberate. Something ancient in my brain reacted before logic could. I stopped. Pike grabbed my arm. Keep moving. It was not mechanical. It was not human. It was alive. We finished the patrol. Pike logged nothing unusual. As we rode back up, I thought of the word containment. That night, lying in my bunk, I knew I had accepted a contract guarding something that should never have been found. 3 weeks later, the screaming became regular. The screaming did not arrive all at once, and it did not come with alarms or warnings, and that made it worse because it slowly became part of the background noise of the place, like the hum of generators or the hiss of recycled air. And once something becomes background, you stop reacting to it. And that realization frightened me more than the sounds themselves. At first, it happened once every few nights, and always after we descended below level 10, and always from deeper levels we were not cleared to access, and the voices sounded human enough that my mind kept trying to assign faces to them, but distorted enough that something in my chest tightened every time I heard them. They rose suddenly and ended just as suddenly, as if someone had reached over and turned a dial to silence. And Pike was right, because after the first week, I stopped writing them down, because every log I submitted with the same entry felt like a confession of weakness. Acoustic anomaly, duration unknown, source below authorized patrol zone, nothing to investigate. That became the lie I told myself. The other guards never spoke about it. There were 6 of us rotating through the shifts, and all of us were former military with the kind of shared history that teaches you when to stay quiet. We nodded at shift change. We checked our weapons. We avoided eye contact when the screams echoed through the ventilation shafts. Silence became its own kind of agreement. On the night of July 9, 2023, that agreement shattered. I was again paired with Pike on the 10 at night to 10 in the morning rotation, and the facility felt wrong from the moment we arrived. The air was colder than usual, and the lights seemed harsher, as if the walls were reflecting something back at us. Pike was tense and quieter than normal, and when I asked what was going on, he told me the site director had called an emergency meeting with the research staff earlier that evening. Whatever they were working on had gone sideways. That was the first time he had ever acknowledged the presence of researchers out loud, and the way he said it told me everything I needed to know. We were not guarding equipment. We were guarding living things. As we moved through level 8 toward the junction that led deeper, the screams did not come. Instead, there was a clicking sound that echoed faintly through the corridor, and it set my nerves on edge because it was rhythmic and deliberate and not like anything I had heard before. When we reached the junction, Pike stopped dead. One of the red clearance doors stood partially open. That should not have been possible. Those doors were reinforced steel with layered locking systems and manual bolts, and they were never opened without authorization codes that rotated hourly. Cold air spilled out from the gap and carried a smell that made my stomach churn. Pike drew his sidearm and told me to stay behind him. He nudged the door wider with his boot while keeping his body angled away from the opening, and beyond the threshold the corridor dropped into darkness, broken only by dim emergency lighting along the floor. The clicking grew louder and closer, and it was accompanied by a sound like breathing, but deeper and slower, and filled with intent. Pike keyed his radio and reported a Code 7 breach and ordered backup, while Command told us to maintain position and not attempt entry. Pike ignored the last part. He moved to the observation panel mounted beside the door and pressed his thumb to the biometric reader. The screen flickered to life with a thermal feed, and what appeared there erased any doubt left in my mind. Heat signatures moved through the corridor, multiple shapes, tall, angular, too fast. Their movement was coordinated and purposeful, like predators closing distance. One of them accelerated toward the door with impossible speed, and the clicking became a thunderous rhythm. Pike slammed the control, and the door began to close, but not fast enough. Something struck it from the other side with enough force to shake the frame, and the impact reverberated through the corridor like a blast. Alarms screamed and red lights flashed, and through the narrowing gap I saw a hand reach out, scaled skin the color of old stone, fingers too long and bent in places human joints do not bend. Claws scraped metal as the door sealed and the locks engaged. The sound of that scrape followed me into my dreams for weeks. The response team arrived within minutes wearing gear I had never seen and carrying weapons that did not resemble anything issued in conventional units. They erected barriers and activated a humming field that made my teeth ache, and then Captain Hargrove appeared with a look that stripped any remaining warmth from his face. He demanded to know who opened the door, and Pike told him it had been unsecured when we arrived. Hargrove asked if Pike had used the observation panel, and Pike admitted he had. "What did you see?" Hargrove asked. Pike hesitated, then reported non-standard heat signatures and a possible containment breach. Hargrove laughed without humor and told him possible was not a word used in this facility. Then he turned to me and told me I was being reassigned immediately. I protested, and he cut me off and explained my options in cold, precise language. Accept reassignment to deep-level security with a clearance upgrade, or return to Bragg under penalties that would end my career and possibly my freedom. Pike gave me a subtle shake of his head that I barely caught. I accepted the reassignment. Medical screening followed immediately, and this time it was different. More blood, more scans. A psychologist asked questions about extraterrestrial life and my tolerance for cognitive dissonance. And when it was over, they handed me a black badge with clearance indicators I had never seen. My first deep-level patrol began at 2 in the morning. I was paired with a former Marine named Torres, who handed me a modified sidearm and told me to aim center mass and keep firing if containment failed. The elevator descended past level 10, then 12, then 15, and when it stopped, we were 600 feet underground. The walls were not concrete anymore. They were warm and slightly flexible, and the air was thick with chemical and biological smells that made my eyes water. Torres called it the terrarium. We passed observation windows that revealed chambers filled with equipment and movement that was not human, and he told me the hardest part was accepting that everything we had been taught about being alone was a lie. In a massive chamber 3 stories tall, I saw them clearly for the first time. Reptilian beings moving through an artificial desert under heat lamps, ancient, intelligent, watching us with calm interest. One approached the glass and pressed its clawed hand against it, and in that moment I felt like prey, not physically, evolutionarily, as if I were standing before something that had ruled this world long before my species learned to walk upright. I could not move. Torres told me some thought it was a greeting, others thought it was territorial. He believed they were studying us. When we left, I knew the word containment had never been about keeping them in. It was about keeping us ignorant. The days that followed blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable, and every descent into the deep levels stripped away another layer of denial I had been clinging to since that first night behind the red door. Patrols became less about checking seals and more about enduring what I saw without reacting, and every debrief felt like a psychological test designed to measure how much truth a human mind could absorb without breaking. The terrarium revealed itself slowly, as if the facility wanted to control the pace of my understanding. Each sector showed variations of the same impossible reality. Containment chambers holding beings that watched us with expressions that suggested awareness rather than confusion. Monitoring stations displaying biological data that defied known parameters. Researchers moving with quiet urgency and avoiding eye contact with guards as if proximity itself was dangerous. Torres walked me through the routines with practiced calm and explained that the worst mistake was trying to rationalize what you saw. Once you accepted that everything you had been taught was incomplete, survival became easier. On July 24, 2023, I was assigned to escort a research team deeper than I had ever been. The elevator descent lasted 3 full minutes, and when the doors opened, the air felt heavy and still, like a vault sealed from the world above. Dr. Sarah Vance led the team, a geneticist who had been on site for 6 years. She moved with purpose and spoke with the controlled cadence of someone who had learned to distance herself from the moral weight of her work. She told me we were entering the archive, a place discovered during excavation in the 1950s when engineers broke into chambers that were already ancient. The walls here were smooth and black and etched with symbols that were not human. Sound seemed to die as we walked, and even my boots felt muted against the floor. Dr. Vance explained that these chambers were records, a library created long before written human history. When she opened one of the containers, she revealed crystalline tablets engraved with intricate patterns and activated a portable display showing translated symbols. According to the data, the reptilians had lived on Earth for over 100,000 years. They built underground civilizations while early humans hunted and gathered above them. They observed our development and occasionally intervened to accelerate it. She told me the truth about Roswell, that it had not been a crash but a delegation, an offer of exchange, technology for secrecy, knowledge for access. My stomach turned as she explained the cost: genetic research, human subjects, controlled disappearances chosen to minimize attention. The screaming I had heard was no anomaly. It was the sound of the agreement being upheld. A military liaison joined the explanation and spoke with cold certainty. He said the reptilians could end human civilization if they chose, and that our survival depended on cooperation. Every president since Eisenhower had approved continuation. Thousands sacrificed for dominance. I asked about the experiments. Dr. Vance showed images of hybrid failures, beings caught between species. Some children, all imprisoned. Sector 12 housed them, maximum containment. I escorted the team back in silence, unable to reconcile the scale of what I had learned. Pike found me on the surface later and told me it got easier, not better. He said walking away would change nothing, that documentation might someday matter. That night I decided to record everything, encrypt it, preserve it. 3 months passed and the routine settled into something like normal until October 12th arrived. I was assigned to Sector 12 with Torres and 2 guards I barely knew. The atmosphere there was different, heavier, the screaming was constant and unfiltered, human voices layered with something else. In Chamber 47, I saw a young woman twisted by genetic modification, awake, aware. She mouthed the word help. Her file said acquired March 2023, termination recommended within 48 hours. I initiated the emergency release. Torres shouted. Alarms erupted. She ran. I opened 6 more chambers. Chaos followed. I ran for the archive. Security caught me near Junction Echo 3 and used a weapon that shut down my nervous system. Hargrove stood over me and said what we did was necessary. He said I would disappear. They sealed me in a containment chamber. I do not know how long I was there. Then one day the door opened and a reptilian stood before me. Ancient, calm, its thoughts pressed against mine. Gratitude, alliance. It led me through service corridors and out into the desert night. I walked for 3 days until I reached a road. Now I record this knowing they are searching. The truth is real, and once you know it, you can never unknown it. Freedom did not feel like victory when it finally came, and that surprised me because I had imagined escape as something sharp and explosive. And instead it arrived quietly wrapped in confusion and exhaustion and fear of what would come next. The desert night swallowed me as I emerged from the hidden vent, and the air felt unreal against my lungs, as if my body had forgotten what unfiltered oxygen was supposed to feel like. I stood there for a long moment, staring back at the facility above the terrarium, at the cluster of innocent-looking buildings that hid a world of suffering and compromise and betrayal beneath them. The reptilian that had guided me out stood beside me for only a heartbeat longer, and then it was gone, moving with a speed and silence that made me question whether I had imagined it or whether my mind was trying to protect itself by rewriting reality. I walked because there was nothing else to do. I walked until my legs shook, and then I walked more because stopping felt more dangerous than collapsing. The desert stretched endlessly, and every shadow looked like pursuit, and every sound felt like a drone or a patrol vehicle closing in. I rationed my water without counting because numbers felt meaningless out there, and I followed the stars the way I had been taught years earlier in another war in another place. By the second day, the sun burned my skin raw, and my thoughts began to blur, and I wondered if this was how they expected it to end for men like me, not with a bullet or a cell, but with exposure and denial. On the 3rd day, I reached the road, and a truck driver picked me up and asked no questions when he saw my condition, because some people understand when silence is safer. I told him I had been hiking and gotten lost, and he nodded like he did not believe me but did not care. When I reached Las Vegas, I disappeared into a motel room and locked the door and listened for footsteps in the hallway for hours before I slept. When I woke, I began recording everything, every patrol. Every scream, every chamber, every name. I encrypted the files and uploaded them to places I hoped would survive me because I knew they would come. They always come. While I worked, memories resurfaced that I had pushed aside during survival mode. Dr. Vance in the archive explaining the translations, the calm certainty in her voice when she spoke about the agreements, the way the military liaison framed sacrifice as necessity and survival as justification, the way Pike had looked at me when I chose reassignment, not warning, resignation. As the days passed, I realized something else that unsettled me more than the terror of being hunted. The reptilians had not treated me as an enemy. They had not restrained me or punished me or even spoken in the way humans speak. What I felt from them was recognition, an understanding that crossed species and language and hierarchy. They had been imprisoned and studied and exploited, and yet when I chose to break the system, they responded with alliance. That realization forced me to reevaluate everything I had been taught about who the enemy was. The humans running Area 53 spoke of national security and dominance and survival while trading lives like currency and calling it progress. The reptilians spoke without words and offered freedom when they had no obligation to do so. I began to understand that containment had never been about protecting humanity. It had been about protecting power. As I replayed the events leading up to my decision, I saw the pattern clearly. The selection of subjects. The quotas, the classification of suffering as acceptable loss, the psychological conditioning of guards to ignore screams and log them as anomalies, the deliberate separation of security from research to prevent empathy from forming. It was all designed to make ordinary people participate in something monstrous while believing they were doing their duty. I thought of Subject 47 Delta and the way she had looked at me through the glass. Not as a guard, not as an authority, but as another human who might choose to act. That moment had broken something in me that could not be repaired, and I no longer wanted it repaired. I knew then that even if they found me and silenced me, the truth would not stay buried forever because systems built on secrecy eventually rot from within. I began to receive messages through anonymous channels. Warnings, threats disguised as concern, offers of help that felt like traps. I ignored them all and kept recording. Each night I expected a knock on the door that never came, and each morning I woke surprised that I was still alive. Fear became routine and routine became resolve. I understood then why Pike had stayed, why Torres followed orders even when they sickened him, why Dr. Vance compartmentalized her conscience. The system was too large to fight directly and too entrenched to dismantle from within. The only weapon left was truth, and truth was dangerous because it could not be controlled once released. I do not know how long I will remain free. I do not know whether the files will reach someone brave enough to act on them or whether they will be dismissed as fiction or madness. I know only that Area 53 exists, that agreements were signed trading human lives for technology, that beings older than our civilizations live beneath our feet and watch us with patience and calculation, that the screams are real and that silence is complicity. If this recording ends abruptly, understand that it was not an accident, it was a consequence. But also understand that knowledge spreads in ways power cannot predict, and that once even one person chooses to speak, the darkness loses its monopoly. I guarded their secret once. I will not do it again. Living outside the facility did not bring relief the way I had imagined, because once the truth settles into your bones, there is no clean air left anywhere, and every place becomes a perimeter you cannot stop scanning. I moved between cheap rooms and borrowed spaces, never staying long enough to be noticed, and I slept with the lights off and the television on low volume, so the silence would not feel like a trap. Each day I replayed the same memories, and each night I tried to order them into something that made sense, because if I could understand the shape of what had happened, then maybe I could survive it. I remembered the weeks after my reassignment when the terrarium became familiar in the way a battlefield does once you learn where death likes to hide. I learned the cadence of patrols and the way the lighting shifted as we passed from one sector to another, and the smells that meant biological testing versus medical intervention. I learned which doors were never opened and which observation windows were covered not to protect us, but to protect the research staff from seeing the eyes watching them back. Torres taught me how to move without drawing attention and how to breathe through the moments when the sounds pressed too hard against your skull. He told me most guards lasted a few rotations before requesting transfer or breaking down, and that those who stayed learned how to hollow themselves out just enough to keep functioning. I watched that happen to him, and I watched it begin to happen to me. The reptilians were not all the same, and that became clear over time. Some paced their chambers with restless energy, and others remained motionless for hours, as if sleep and wakefulness meant nothing to them. Some reacted to our presence with hostility, and others with curiosity, and a few with something that felt like disdain. The nonviolent specimens, as the researchers called them, cooperated because cooperation offered stability and reduced pain, and even then I sensed they were choosing restraint, not submission. During one patrol in Sector 4, I stopped near an observation window and met the gaze of one of the Ancient Ones, and in that instant I felt a pressure behind my eyes like a thought trying to take shape. It was not a command and it was not a threat. It felt like a question. The realization shook me more than the night of the breach because it meant communication was possible, and had been withheld not by them but by us. Later I asked Torres if the researchers had attempted direct contact, and he told me there had been attempts decades earlier, but they were abandoned when the results could not be controlled. Controlled was the word used when truth threatened hierarchy. I thought of the archive and the records etched into black stone, and the implication that history had been rewritten to keep humanity comfortable in its ignorance. As the months passed, the research intensified, and the quotas increased, and I heard more discussions in hushed tones about genetic bottlenecks and compatibility markers and yield projections. The language was clinical and efficient and stripped of humanity by design. I saw human subjects brought through service corridors hooded and restrained, and I watched researchers avert their eyes, as if proximity itself might infect them with guilt. I told myself I was there to observe and record, and that someday documentation would matter, but the lie grew heavier with each passing shift. The night of October 12th did not arrive suddenly. It was built from countless small compromises and moments when I chose obedience over resistance. When I was assigned to Sector 12, I felt something tighten in my chest because I knew that level represented the failures, the things that did not fit neatly into reports, the beings too unstable to study and too dangerous to release. The atmosphere there was saturated with despair, and the screaming was constant, not as outbursts but as a low ongoing chorus that never fully stopped. I saw hybrids that could speak and hybrids that could only moan, and reptilians that had lost whatever equilibrium captivity once allowed them. When I saw Subject 47 Delta, it was not just her suffering that broke me, it was the timestamp. Acquired March 2023. While I had been running perimeter at Bragg and considering contracts and pay rates, she had been living a life somewhere above ground, unaware that it would end beneath the desert. The logs documented her decline with detached precision, and the recommendation for termination read like a scheduling note. That was the moment I understood that waiting for someone else to act was the same as endorsing what was happening. When I initiated the release protocol, the alarms were loud, but the silence inside me was louder. Opening those chambers felt like stepping into a current you can no longer fight. Each door that unsealed carried consequences I could not fully calculate, and I accepted that because calculation had been the excuse for every atrocity I had witnessed. The chaos that followed was immediate and violent, and I heard gunfire and screams and the impact of bodies against walls as containment failed. I ran because movement was the only option left, and I aimed for the archive because information was the only leverage I had ever truly possessed. When the weapon struck me and my body collapsed, I felt relief because the decision was no longer mine to carry. Hargrove told me I had cost lives and research, and I wanted to tell him that cost was the language he had taught us all to speak. In the chamber where they left me, time became meaningless and pain dulled into background noise, and the screaming took on a different quality because now it was close and constant and impossible to log away. When the Ancient One opened the door and stood before me, there was no fear left because fear had already done its worst. The exchange that followed did not require words, and in that moment, I understood that alliances are not born from similarity, but from shared understanding of captivity. As I sit here now, moving again and listening for footsteps that may never come, I know that survival is not the same as absolution, and that freedom carries its own weight. I carry the faces of those I could not save, and the knowledge that exposing the truth may change nothing at all. But silence would have been easier, and that is precisely why it could not be allowed. If this reaches you, then remember that systems depend on people believing they are powerless. I believed that once, and it nearly erased me. I do not believe it anymore. The longer I stayed alive, the more I understood that survival itself was becoming an anomaly, and that realization settled over me with a weight heavier than fear, because fear at least sharpens the senses while expectation erodes them. Each day, outside the facility felt borrowed and provisional, as if the world had already decided I no longer belonged in it, and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I moved through crowds and streets and public places with the same habits I had learned underground. Watching reflections, tracking exits, measuring distances, listening for patterns that did not fit. Sleep came in fragments filled with images that replayed without mercy, the hand against the glass, the clicking in the corridor, Subject 47 Del to mouthing the word help. I woke drenched in sweat and reached for weapons that were no longer there. And when I realized where I was, the panic came anyway, because knowing you are free does not erase the conditioning that taught you freedom is temporary. I spent my days refining the files I had taken and organizing them into something coherent, because raw truth is fragile and easily dismissed, but structured truth can survive scrutiny. I cross-referenced patrol logs with research schedules and mapped containment breaches against disappearance reports and government contracts that pretended to be infrastructure funding. Patterns emerged that confirmed what Dr. Vance had implied. The agreement was not static, it evolved. As technology advanced, the price increased, and as public awareness grew, the selection criteria became more precise. The subjects were chosen not only for genetic markers but for social invisibility. Migrants, runaways, isolated individuals, people whose absence could be folded into existing narratives. Each scream had a name attached to it somewhere, and each name had been erased by design. I remembered Pike telling me the program would continue with or without us, and that knowledge returned now with bitter clarity. The machinery of secrecy does not require belief. It only requires participation and silence. I thought about Torres and wondered where he stood when the alarms sounded, and whether he survived the chaos that followed my actions. I thought about Pike, and whether he logged my disappearance as another anomaly, or whether some part of him understood that I had chosen the path he could not. These thoughts did not bring comfort, but they grounded me in the reality that choices ripple outward even when they seem isolated. One night, as I reviewed archived footage, my laptop screen flickered, and for a moment I saw a symbol that mirrored the ones etched into the black walls of the archive. It vanished before I could capture it and left me questioning whether exhaustion had begun to blur the boundaries again. The possibility that the reptilians might still be watching me did not frighten me the way it once would have. If anything, it felt consistent. They had monitored humanity for longer than our recorded history, and it would be naive to assume that relationship ended when I walked into the desert. What unsettled me was the thought that humans were still blind to their own role in the hierarchy they claimed to control. We believed ourselves apex because we defined the terms and ignored the evidence that contradicted us. The reptilians did not need to dominate openly because they understood time differently. Patience was their greatest advantage, and we mistook it for weakness. As I continued documenting, I revisited the archive material in my mind and the fragments Dr. Vance had translated. References to cycles, to rises and collapses of surface civilizations, to periods where intervention was necessary to prevent extinction or to steer development toward stability. The implication was not benevolence but pragmatism. Humans were not cherished, we were managed. That realization stripped away the last remnants of comforting mythology. We were neither chosen nor special, we were useful, and usefulness was conditional. I wondered how many past civilizations had reached similar thresholds, and how many had vanished without leaving more than myths and broken stones. The desert around Area 53 had likely swallowed countless such stories, and the silence above it was not accidental. As days passed without contact, I allowed myself to believe I might have slipped through the cracks, but belief is dangerous because it invites complacency. The knock came at a motel door just after midnight on what I think was the fifth night. 3 sharp taps, not hurried, not aggressive, controlled. I did not answer. I waited with my back against the wall and my breath held, and after a long moment footsteps moved away. Whether it was them or an unrelated visitor, I never knew, but the message was clear. I was not forgotten. That night I recorded another message and duplicated the files again and sent them to new locations because redundancy was the only defense left to me. As I worked, I reflected on the moment the Ancient One opened my chamber and the sense of alliance that followed. It had not been an act of charity, it had been a calculation. By freeing me, they disrupted a system that benefited from secrecy and exploitation. In doing so, they advanced their own interests while aligning with my need for escape. That complexity mattered because it mirrored the reality of power itself. There were no pure actors in this story, only competing agendas and degrees of harm. The difference was that the reptilians did not pretend their actions were moral. They did not dress necessity in the language of virtue. Humans did. That hypocrisy was what finally pushed me beyond fear and into resolve. If I was going to disappear, it would not be quietly. I would leave behind a record that could not be easily erased and a narrative that challenged the foundations of comfortable ignorance. I knew there would be attempts to discredit me, to label me unstable, to frame my testimony as trauma-induced delusion. That strategy was already embedded in the system, and I had seen it applied to others. The medical language, the reassignment, the secure facilities masquerading as care. I anticipated it and prepared accordingly by embedding verifiable data alongside personal testimony, because emotion alone could be dismissed, but corroborated evidence demanded engagement. As dawn approached and light crept through the thin curtains, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. Not peace, acceptance. I had crossed a threshold from which return was impossible, and that clarity carried its own kind of strength. The truth had cost me everything familiar, but it had also stripped away illusions that once constrained me. I no longer measured my worth by rank or contracts or obedience. I measured it by the simple refusal to pretend I had not seen what I had seen. Somewhere beneath the desert, the terrarium still existed, and the chambers were still occupied, and the agreements were still being honored. My actions had not ended that reality, but they had disrupted it, and disruption was a beginning even if it came too late for many. I thought again of Subject 47 Delta and hoped she had reached the surface, or at least found a moment of freedom before the darkness closed again. That hope was fragile, but it mattered because hope is what systems of control seek to extinguish first. As I finish this section of my account, I am aware that time is narrowing, and that each word brings me closer to whatever end has been scheduled for me. I accept that. The fear that once kept me compliant no longer holds the same power. If this record survives, then my voice will outlast my body, and that is more than I was ever promised when I signed that contract. Let this stand as proof that silence was never ignorance. It was choice, and I chose differently. I am recording this final section knowing that time has narrowed to a thin corridor, and that whatever comes next is already in motion, because systems like the one I escaped do not forgive breaches, and they do not forget assets that slip their leash. Every instinct I have tells me they are close, not because I see them, but because absence has a shape when you have lived inside surveillance long enough, and the quiet around me feels engineered rather than accidental. I have changed locations again and again, but geography means little when your enemy operates above law and beyond consequence and understands patience better than any human institution ever could. As I speak these words, I am calm in a way that surprises me, and that calm comes not from hope of survival, but from completion, because the story has been told in full and there is nothing left to withhold. I think back to the moment I first heard the word containment spoken with such casual authority, and how my mind tried to fit it into familiar frameworks like weapons or documents or technology, because accepting that it referred to living beings would have required a reckoning I was not ready for. Then, that reckoning came anyway, layer by layer, until denial collapsed under its own weight, and I could no longer pretend that obedience was neutral or that following orders absolved responsibility. I think of Pike and his tired eyes and the way he warned me without warning, and I wonder whether he still walks those corridors logging anomalies and pretending the screams are not human because that lie was the only armor he had left. I think of Torres and his practiced calm, and the way he taught me to hollow myself out just enough to function, and I wonder whether he survived the chaos or whether he became another acceptable loss, folded into a report and forgotten by design. I think of Dr. Vance and the conflict she carried behind her controlled voice, and whether she ever allowed herself to imagine a world where knowledge was not hoarded and rationed like a weapon. I think of the military liaison and his certainty that sacrifice was necessary, and I understand now that necessity is the most dangerous word a system can use because it turns atrocities into logistics and suffering into spreadsheets. Above all, I think of those whose names I never learned because they were never meant to be known, and whose voices echoed through ventilation shafts and were labeled anomalies so that no one would have to confront what they meant. Those voices were real, and they mattered, and they were the price paid for an illusion of dominance that humanity clings to because admitting otherwise would shatter the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. The reptilians did not shatter those stories. We did. We shattered them when we chose secrecy over accountability and progress over compassion and control over truth. The ancient one that opened my cell did not speak, but the concepts it shared were clearer than any words, and what it conveyed was not benevolence but balance. A recognition that systems built on exploitation eventually destabilize, and that intervention becomes necessary not out of kindness but out of self-interest. Humans like to imagine themselves at the center of every narrative, but the truth is we are one variable among many, and our insistence on supremacy has blinded us to realities that have always existed beneath our feet. The agreements signed decades ago were not the beginning of this story, and they will not be the end. They were simply one chapter in a much longer cycle of observation and adjustment and management, and whether humanity survives the next chapter depends on choices still being made in rooms without windows by people who will never hear the screams they authorize. I do not pretend that exposing this truth will suddenly dismantle those structures, or that revelation alone will bring justice to those who suffered, because history suggests otherwise. Power rarely relinquishes itself willingly, and institutions rarely confess to crimes that ensured their survival. But truth has a way of seeping through cracks and altering trajectories in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled, and that uncertainty is what those in power fear most. They fear not judgment but loss of narrative control, because narratives are the scaffolding that holds their authority in place. If enough people begin to question the foundations, then the structure weakens even if it does not collapse immediately. That is why they silence voices like mine, not because one testimony can topple an empire, but because it can inspire others to look closer and ask harder questions and refuse easy answers. I am under no illusion that my actions make me a hero, because heroes are a comforting fiction, and this story has no clean lines between good and evil. I made choices that cost lives, and I carry that weight with me, and I will carry it until the end. What I reject is the idea that doing nothing would have been morally superior, or that compliance would have spared me responsibility. There is no neutral ground inside a system built on exploitation, and the only real choice is whether to acknowledge that fact or hide behind procedure. I chose to acknowledge it, and whatever consequences follow are preferable to the hollow existence I was sliding into when I logged screams and pretended they were mechanical. If you are hearing this, then you are now part of the equation, whether you want to be or not, because knowledge once gained cannot be set aside without effort, and that effort itself is a choice. You may dismiss this as fiction or delusion or propaganda, because that is easier than confronting its implications, and I understand the temptation because I lived inside that comfort for years. But ask yourself why stories like this are so aggressively ridiculed and buried and discredited, while other far less substantiated narratives are allowed to flourish. Ask yourself who benefits from your disbelief and what structures remain unchallenged because of it. Area 53 exists, the terrarium exists, the agreements exist, the hybrids exist, the screams exist. The fact that these statements are unsettling does not make them false, it makes them inconvenient. If there is any message I want to leave behind, it is this: do not confuse normalcy with safety or silence with peace. Systems that demand your ignorance are not protecting you, they are protecting themselves. The world is far older and far stranger and far more layered than we are taught, and pretending otherwise does not make it simpler. It only makes us more vulnerable to those who understand it better than we do. I do not know how much time I have left, or whether this recording will be my last act, or merely another file buried among many waiting to be discovered. I know only that I have said what needed to be said, and that in doing so, I have reclaimed a piece of myself that was nearly lost in the corridors beneath the desert. My name is Staff Sergeant Elias Crow, and I was a guard at Area 53, and the beings they kept hidden were never prisoners in the way we were taught to understand the word. They were witnesses and participants in a long negotiation that humanity entered without the consent of its people and maintained through fear and secrecy. If I disappear after this, then remember that disappearance is not proof of falsehood. It is often proof of threat. Whatever you choose to do with this knowledge, do it with open eyes and an honest understanding of the cost, because ignorance is not innocence once the truth has been spoken. This is where my account ends, not because the story is finished, but because my role in it is. What happens next belongs to those who hear this and decide that comfort is no longer worth the price of silence. If this story reached you, then it survived for a reason, and that reason is now in your hands. Do not let it end here in silence or doubt. Share it, talk about it, question the narratives you are given and the truths you are told to ignore. Stay alert, stay curious, and remember that darkness survives only when people look away. If you want more stories like this, if you want the hidden layers exposed and the untold truths brought into the light, then follow this channel and stay with me. Because once you know the truth, you can never unknow it, and neither can they silence everyone who hears it.